At 40 degrees Celsius, the margin for error is basically zero. A lot of people think a tough tent or an expensive sleeping bag is the answer, but in real extreme cold, the stuff that looks reliable can fail fast, especially with wind, moisture, and heat loss to the ground. In this video, we're breaking down the shelter design that actually works because it's built around simple physics. Block wind, cut down empty space, insulate from the ground, and trap still air without soaking everything in moisture. This is educational content for emergency preparedness. Don't test extreme cold shelter ideas as a challenge, and always follow local weather warnings and safety guidance. Number 1. Cold weather is a heat loss math problem. At 40 degrees Celsius, the danger isn't just being uncomfortable. The danger is that your body can't keep up with the heat you're losing, and you start sliding toward hypothermia. Hypothermia is a medical emergency that happens when core body temperature drops below 95 degrees. It doesn't only show up in movie-style blizzards either. It can happen in milder air temperatures when a person gets chilled by rain, sweat, or cold water. Then wind speeds up the heat loss. The reason this matters for prepping is simple. Once your core starts cooling, you don't just get colder, you get less capable, and mistakes get easier to make. Early warning signs are not dramatic. It's shivering, feeling tired, getting clumsy, and getting mentally foggy. That fog is the real threat because it leads to shortcuts, skipping steps, rushing, forgetting gear, or building a shelter that looks okay, but leaks heat all night. In wilderness medicine circles, people sometimes talk about the umbles, fumbling, mumbling, stumbling, and grumbling, because those small changes show up before things become severe. If you ever see that pattern in yourself or someone else in the cold, treat it as a serious warning sign and start fixing the heat loss problem right away. Get out of wind, get dry, and get sheltered. A practical way to think about it is to track how heat leaves the body. Wilderness medicine breaks heat loss into 4 main routes: conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. Conduction is heat leaking into anything you're touching, especially cold ground. Convection is moving air carrying heat away, which is why wind makes the same air temperature feel far harsher. Radiation is your body giving off heat to the environment. Evaporation is sweat and moisture pulling heat as it dries. Wind chill is basically a warning label for convection. It doesn't make the air colder, but it can make exposed skin lose heat fast enough that frostbite can happen quickly. That's why official weather guidance includes frostbite risk and time to freeze estimates on wind chill charts. In other words, wind turns a bad temperature into a dangerous one. Now add moisture. Wet clothing and wet skin increase heat loss, and even small amounts of sweat can chill you hard once you stop moving. CDC guidance for cold travel is blunt. Staying dry matters because wet clothing can chill the body rapidly and increase heat loss. This is where beginners often get trapped. They work hard, sweat under layers, then stop to rest, and the cold shows up all at once. So when someone says, "I've got gear rated for winter," the next question is, will it still work when it's windy, when you're damp, when you're tired, and when you need fine motor skills to set everything up? If the answer is shaky, the shelter plan has to carry more of the load. Number 2, what a shelter must do in real cold. A winter shelter that keeps you alive at 40 degrees Celsius is not a cozy cabin. It's a system for reducing heat loss. The most common prepper mistake is building or choosing a shelter that looks protective, but still leaks heat in the exact ways that matter. Start with the ground. People obsess over air temperature and forget that the ground is a giant heat sink. If you lie directly on snow, frozen soil, or cold rock, conduction will pull heat out of you for hours. This is why outdoor safety and wilderness medicine put so much emphasis on ground insulation. Even a thick sleeping bag loses a lot of usefulness underneath you because insulation works by trapping air, and your body weight crushes that trapped air flat. In plain terms, a bag can be warm on top and still fail underneath unless you add real insulation between you and the ground. Next is airflow. Wind doesn't need to be screaming to cause trouble. Any steady air movement through a shelter replaces the warm air your body builds up with cold air. That's convection, and it keeps your temperature stuck even if you have insulation. A shelter has to block wind, not just shade you from snow. Then comes moisture control. Your clothing, your breath, and your sweat add water to the system. Wet insulation loses warmth. The more airtight you make a shelter, the more you risk condensation and dampness building up. The more open you make it, the more wind steals your heat. So the goal isn't sealed forever or wide open. The goal is controlled airflow, block wind, keep the volume small, and avoid soaking the insulation. This is also where bigger is better fails. A large interior is comfortable in mild weather. In extreme cold, it's extra air you have to warm, and extra surface area for heat to leak out. For a pure warmth shelter, smaller usually wins. The shelter should fit your body's needs, not your imagination of camping. Here's a quick reality check on common prepper items. Reflective emergency blankets can help reduce radiant heat loss, but they don't magically insulate you from the ground, and they don't stop wind unless they're used as part of a real wind barrier. Same with a tarp. It can block wind and precipitation, but without insulation and a tight setup, you can still get chilled fast. The shelter that works at 40 degree F is the one that handles all the heat loss routes, not just one. So the checklist is simple. Block wind, insulate from the ground, trap still air, and keep moisture from turning your insulation into a wet sponge. If a shelter can't do those 4 things, it's not a 40 shelter, no matter how tough it looks. Number 3, the shelter design most people underestimate. When gear fails or conditions outrun your plans, the most reliable emergency design in the woods is an insulated crawl-in shelter made from natural insulation. It goes by different names: debris hut, thermal A-frame, leaf hut. But the physics is the same. A small frame covered in a thick blanket of plant matter that traps dead air and blocks wind. What makes this design work is not the shape. It's the insulation thickness and the tiny interior volume. A lot of survival content shows a shelter with a thin roof because it looks clean and fast. In real cold, that's a trap. A thin layer blocks some wind, but doesn't slow heat transfer enough to matter. The U.S. Army Survival Manual gives straightforward guidance on this shelter, and it includes numbers that are hard to ignore. It describes the debris hut as one of the best shelters for warmth and ease of construction, and it specifically calls for an outer layer of light, dry debris that's at least 1 meter, about 3 feet, thick. Thicker is better. It also calls for a substantial inner layer of insulation inside the shelter, around 30 centimeters, about 1 foot. And it recommends adding an outer shingling layer of branches on top so the insulation doesn't blow away in storms. Those numbers matter because insulation isn't a guess. Insulation is trapped air. The deeper the layer of loose, dry debris, the harder it is for heat to move through it. A thin layer looks like coverage, but it doesn't protect your core temperature when the outside air is stripping heat nonstop. If you strip it down to a simple build concept, there are 4 parts. You create a strong ridge line and ribs that form a wedge-shaped tunnel. It needs to be wide enough for your body, but not roomy. Over the ribs, you add smaller sticks crosswise so the debris won't fall into your sleeping area. Then you pile on the insulation until it's thick in every direction, not just on top. Finally, you build a thick insulated bed inside because the ground will keep stealing heat unless you separate yourself from it. That bed matters more than people expect. If you're lying down, your shoulders, hips, and feet compress whatever bedding you have. If the bedding is thin, those contact points become cold spots. A good rule is to assume you'll compress at least half of what you put down. So you want enough material that, even after compression, you still have a real insulating layer between you and the ground. The entrance is the biggest weak point. Heat pours out of a big opening. That's why this design works best with a small crawl-in entrance and an insulated plug you can pull into place once you're inside. The goal is to reduce air exchange without making the space unsafe to breathe. You're aiming for a controlled gap and a wind block, not an airtight seal. There's also a practical prepper lesson hidden in this. This shelter doesn't depend on zippers, poles, or fabric coatings. It depends on physics and local material. That's why it's worth knowing even if you own great winter gear. Gear is great until it's wet, damaged, or missing. The physics still works. Also, a safety point that keeps people safer. Build without soaking yourself in sweat. In extreme cold, sweat is a delayed problem. Pace your work, vent layers while moving, and protect a dry layer so you can change once you're inside. Number 4. The upgrade that keeps insulation working. Most people who talk about shelters focus on the frame and forget the slow failure. Moisture. If you plan to stay put for more than a short emergency window, moisture control becomes the difference between warm enough and everything is damp and cold. Your breath is warm and wet. In a cold shelter, that moisture condenses as frost and eventually melts into dampness around the inner surface. Over time, even dry debris insulation can get damp near the inner surface. When insulation gets wet, it loses warmth fast, so you need two things that sound like opposites: protection from moisture and enough ventilation to breathe safely. A common solution in cold weather systems is a vapor barrier layer. The basic idea is to slow down moisture from migrating into your insulation. In a debris hut-style shelter, that could mean placing a sheet of plastic, a tarp, or another barrier layer between the inner stick lattice and the outer debris, so the debris stays drier longer. But here's the critical safety point. You still need airflow. You don't want an airtight plastic capsule. Controlled airflow matters for safe breathing and for keeping humid air from saturating everything around you. If you're in deep snow terrain, snow shelters are another option people mention for extreme cold, because snow can be an excellent insulator thanks to trapped air pockets inside it. Snow also blocks wind, which removes a huge part of the problem. But snow shelters come with extra risks: collapse risk, getting buried in drifting snow, and ventilation problems. National Park Service winter safety guidance specifically warns that snow caves, tents, and igloos need adequate ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning, and it warns that cooking in shelters consumes oxygen quickly. This is why "a small fire fixes everything" is a dangerous shortcut in extreme cold. Fire can help, but it also creates smoke, sparks, and carbon monoxide risk in enclosed spaces. And it encourages people to open up the shelter so much that wind steals the heat anyway. If you use any heat source, it has to be done with real ventilation and real caution, not as a casual trick. Site selection is the other upgrade that doesn't cost anything. The Army Manual points out that low ground like ravines and narrow valleys collects heavier cold air at night and can be colder than nearby higher ground. Picking a site that's sheltered from wind, not sitting in a cold air pool, and free of overhead hazards is part of the shelter design. A warm shelter in a bad spot is still a bad plan. So the shelter upgrade is not one fancy trick, it's a mindset. Keep insulation dry, keep airflow safe, and pick a site that doesn't magnify the cold. Number 5. Beginner prepper moves that stop 40 from becoming your problem. If you're building a prepping plan as a beginner, the smartest move is to make 40 degrees mihen. A scenario you avoid, not a scenario you prove you can handle. Preparedness is about reducing risk, reducing exposure time, and keeping choices simple when conditions are harsh. Start with weather awareness and time. A lot of winter emergencies come from poor planning. People stay out longer than they should, they underestimate wind, or they assume a short trip can't become a long delay. Your first layer of preparedness is knowing when to turn around, when to stay put, and when to call for help early. Then build your cold fundamentals around staying dry and blocking wind. CDC cold travel guidance is clear that sweat and wet clothing can chill the body rapidly and increase heat loss, and it recommends adjusting layers to avoid sweating. That's not just comfort advice, that's survival math. This is why wool and synthetics are generally preferred over cotton in cold conditions. They keep insulating better when damp, while cotton holds water and stays cold against the skin. For gear, keep it boring and functional. The best prepper essentials for winter shelter are the ones that solve the 4 problems: wind, ground, trapped air, and moisture. A compact tarp or bivy-style cover for wind, a foam pad for ground insulation, a way to keep spare layers dry, and high-energy food you can eat without cooking. Add lighting, navigation, and a way to communicate. None of this is glamorous, but it's what keeps you from making desperate choices. Another beginner prepper tip that actually saves lives is the buddy and check-in habit. Traveling with a partner or group, telling someone your route and return time, and carrying a basic emergency kit are simple steps that reduce the chance that a cold delay turns into a medical emergency. That's true in wilderness, suburbs, and urban prepping situations. In deep cold, help is a force multiplier, and isolation is a risk factor. For home preparedness, the same thinking applies. Power outages during extreme cold are a real risk, and your shelter might be one room in your home rather than the whole building. The goal is still to reduce heat loss. Close off unused rooms, block drafts, add insulation under and around sleeping areas, and manage moisture so bedding stays dry. If you use any combustion heat indoors, carbon monoxide detection and ventilation become non-negotiable safety pieces. For a vehicle kit, again, think functions. The vehicle itself blocks wind, but you still need insulation under you, a way to stay dry, and a plan that avoids carbon monoxide danger if the engine is running or if snow blocks vents. Official winter safety advice repeatedly comes back to ventilation and CO risk in enclosed spaces, because that's one of the most common hidden killers in cold weather shelter situations. Also, don't treat shelter skills as a stunt. Learn them as a skill under safe conditions, with supervision and proper training if you're new. The goal is to understand the principles so you can make good decisions fast. Keep the shelter small, insulate thicker than you think, separate from the ground, and manage moisture so your insulation stays effective.